Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Continuing on with the Kitab al-Jinayat, we are on Hadith number 1015 from Umar ibn Shu'aib, from his father, from his grandfather, radiyallahu anhum. He says that a man stabbed another man with a horn of an animal on the other man's knee, so he injured him. And so the victim came to the Prophet and he told the Prophet, "O Prophet, take revenge for me." And the Prophet said, "No, I will not take revenge until your injury is healed." But then the man came again and he said, "O Prophet, take revenge for me." And so the Prophet took revenge. But then afterwards, meaning after the revenge was taken, the victim came and he said, "O Prophet, I have become lame." In other words, the injury has rendered his leg useless, so he's not able to use that leg of his to walk. So in other words, it was far worse than just an injury on the knee. Actually, his whole leg was affected. And so to this the Prophet replied, قَدْ نَهَيْتُكَ فَعَصَيْتَنِي فَأَبْعَدَكَ اللَّهُ وَبَطَلَ عَرَجُكَ. I forbade you from taking revenge, but you disobeyed me. So may Allah put you far away from goodness and render vain your injury or your loss. Meaning to say that you becoming lame is useless and futile, and there is no compensation for it. And then after that, the Prophet forbade that retaliation be taken for an injury sustained before the injury is fully healed. The hadith is sahih. We take from this hadith then that the retaliation does not have to be life for a life, rather it can be injury for injury. But when it comes to al-qisas, there are conditions which must be fulfilled, and we have to speak about them as well. But what we can take from this hadith immediately is that the qisas, when it comes to injury, must not be taken until the wound is healed, because you don't know what will happen in the future. Maybe the wound will get worse. So if it gets worse, then obviously the retaliation or the blood money will be higher. So we take from this that the injury which is sustained by the victim, if it spreads before the qisas is taken, then this spread of the injury, or it getting worse, is something which the perpetrator will have to be taken to account for. So in a case like this, if the victim had waited, so he did not take the qisas, then after he realized that his whole leg is actually become completely useless, then his retaliation would be higher, or his blood money would be higher. So the perpetrator would be a guarantor for this injury spreading. But in this scenario, because the man sought to hasten the qisas, the Prophet ﷺ did not make the perpetrator a guarantor for the spread of the injury. So note the difference. Rather, the Prophet blamed the victim. The victim should not have hastened the qisas. However, what about the other way around? If the perpetrator damages or injures the victim, and then the victim takes the qisas, and because of this qisas, the injury which is delivered to the perpetrator spreads and becomes worse, do we say that the ruler or whoever made this qisas is a guarantor for the spread of this injury? The answer is no, because in this case the qisas took place through the permission of the Sharia. So if it now happens to spread and becomes worse, then this is not the responsibility of anyone, because of the general rule which we have, مَا تَرَتَّبَ عَلَى الْمَأْذُونِ فَلَيْسَ بِمَضْمُونٍ. Whatever results as a consequence of an action which is permissible or has been given permission in the Sharia, then no one is taken to account for it. So we know that qisas is definitely permitted in the Sharia. So if this leads to even more of an injury, or the injury spreads, then nobody is taken to account, because this action took place because of the permission of the Sharia. As opposed to the perpetrator injuring the victim, he did not do this through the permission of the Sharia at all. In fact, what he did was haram. So therefore, if this injury spreads, then the perpetrator is a guarantor. So notice the difference. And also from this narration we can take a general rule that when you disobey the Sharia, then it will have negative consequences. Because here the victim disobeyed the Prophet. The Prophet ordered him to wait for the qisas until the injury fully heals, because we don't know how this injury is going to develop. However, he disobeyed and he sought to hasten the qisas, and so we can see the negative consequences of his actions. The three A'imma, Malik, Abu Hanifa and Ahmed, they say it is haram to ask for qisas or blood money before the injury is fully healed, and Ash-Shafi'i says it is not haram, because in this narration the Prophet did allow the victim to seek the qisas before the injury was fully healed. But most of the scholars say it is haram to even ask for qisas or blood money before the injury heals, because the narration ends off as saying that the Prophet forbade that qisas be made for an injury before it is fully healed. As for if the victim was to wait until the injury develops or heals fully, and he finds that actually the injury has spread, then Al-Imam Malik and Ash-Shafi'i, they say that the qisas can only be taken on the original injury, not the spread of the injury. And Al-Imam Ahmad says that the qisas must be taken on the original injury, but also the spread of the injury. So for example, let's say the perpetrator cuts off the finger of the victim, but this cut leads to an infection and it actually spreads to the whole of the hand, so the whole hand now needs to be removed because of this injury. Now, if the victim was to wait till this stage, he therefore finds that the issue is not just about the finger, it is actually about the whole hand. Well then, in this case, according to Imam Ahmad, the victim has the right to have the perpetrator's whole hand cut off as well. Or if he wants blood money, then he would take the blood money not of the finger, but of the whole hand. So you can see the vast difference. From the contemporary issues on this matter is that if retaliation is taken, let's say retaliation taken in terms of cutting the other person's hand because the perpetrator cut the victim's hand, then are anesthetics allowed to be used when carrying out this qisas? This is the question. Anesthetics will obviously spare the pain, so it will make the hand numb as you are cutting it off. Well, the answer to that is no, because the point is that the perpetrator did not use anesthetics to cut off the victim's hand. Therefore, anesthetics are not allowed to be used to cut off his hand, and that he must feel the pain which the victim felt. And this is justice. Using anesthetics on the perpetrator will not give the same feeling of justice to the victim, because the idea with the qisas or retaliation is that the perpetrator must experience the pain which he inflicted on his victim. Hadith number 1016 from Abu Hurairah. He says that two women from the tribe of Hudayl fought each other, and one woman threw a stone at the other woman, thus killing her and also killing the child inside her belly. So the dispute came to the Prophet, and the Prophet adjudged that the blood money for the fetus in the belly of the woman would be a servant, either a male or a female one. And as for the blood money of the killed woman, then this would be upon the male relatives who are related to the woman from the father's side, and this woman of course is the perpetrating woman, and he made the woman, the dead woman, to inherit from her child, and also the relatives of this unborn child would inherit from his wealth as well. So this is the judgment which he gave, and in response to this, Hamal ibn Nabigha said to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, كيف يغرم من لا شرب ولا أكل ولا نطق ولا استحل فمثل ذلك يضل. O Messenger of Allah, how can we be responsible for paying the blood money of someone who has not drunk anything, nor eaten, nor spoken, nor raised his voice? So a person of this sort of status should simply be neglected. And to this the Prophet replied, إِنَّمَا هَذَا مِنْ إِخْوَانِ الْكُهَّانِ مِنْ أَجْلِ سَجْعِهِ الَّذِي سَجَعَ. Verily this person is from the brothers of the soothsayers because of the rhyming speech which he has made. Muttafaqun alayh. And in a version in the Sunan, Umar radiallahu anh, he asked, who witnessed the decision of the Prophet about the unborn child? And Hamal ibn Nabigha stood up and he narrated this above story. These two women who were fighting each other were what we call in Arabic darratan, two women married to the same man. And it is perfectly natural and normal that these two women will feel jealous of each other. Even the wives of the Prophet would feel jealous of each other, and they were the best of women, still they were not safe from this protective jealousy. And so this is one of the negative aspects of multiple wives, is that they will feel jealous of each other, and clearly we find in this case it led to bloodshed. Not just the death of one person, but the death of two people, the unborn child as well. So one woman threw a stone at the other. Now this stone doesn't normally lead to death. So this was not intentional murder. She did not actually mean to kill her co-wife. But she certainly did mean to injure her. They were both fighting each other. So what we take from this hadith is that when it comes to killing, we do have a third category. The first two categories are obvious, intentional murder and accidental murder, but then we have this third category, which is in the middle, which is quasi-intentional murder, which is when you do in fact intend to hit or injure someone, but you don't intend to kill him, so you would maybe strike him with a weapon, which does not normally lead to death. And in the shibhul amd, or the quasi-intentional murder, the blood money is the responsibility of the aqila, of the male relatives from the father's side, or those male relatives related to you through the father at least. As for those relatives related to you solely through the mother, then they have no say in this. So the aqila are basically the asaba. You'll remember the asaba from the Kitabul Mirath. These are the people who would inherit the rest of the money after the furud have been shared out. But with the aqila, they don't even have to be inheritors. They have to be male relatives who are related through at least the father. And the reason why the aqila would pay is because this is not intentional murder. With intentional murder, only the perpetrator will pay the blood money. He deserves no other help. But because this was not intentional murder, so the perpetrator does deserve some help. We learn that the blood money of the unborn child, then this is a male or female servant. If that's not possible, then the scholars have said that it will be 5 camels. And this is equal to 1/10 of the full blood money of the mother, because the full blood money of the mother in terms of camels is 50 camels, and for a man it would be 100 camels. The blood money of a man is twice that of the woman, in all cases where the blood money is 1/3 of the full blood money or more. But this discussion pertains more to the chapter of blood money. But with the unborn child, we have certain scenarios, and the ruling differs. We'll divide the scenarios up into 2 categories, and then these 2 categories also have their subcategories. So the 2 major categories are the child dying after the soul has been blown into him, and this would be 4 months or later. And in the second category, the child dying before the soul has been blown into him, and this would be before 4 months, as we know from the famous hadith. So, the first category, the child dies in the belly after the soul has been blown into it. So this child is an actual human being. Now, in this category, we have 4 subcategories. Number 1, the child dies along with the mother, meaning to say at the same time. In a case like this, there is no blood money for this child, because it is treated as just another limb of the mother. So the only blood money needed to be paid would be for the mother. Category number 2, if this child comes out of the belly alive after a period where most children are expected to live, so this would be after 6 months, because the minimum time for pregnancy according to the Quran is 6 months. So if he comes out alive after 6 months and then immediately dies, then for this type of child, he will deserve the full blood money, just like any other adult. So he'll be treated like an adult. And this would differ depending on whether he's male or female, because the blood money differs from male to female. Number 3, that he's taken out of the belly of the mother, dead. And number 4, that he's taken out of the belly of the mother, but before 6 months. Because normally children will not be expected to live before 6 months, because the minimum pregnancy is 6 months. So these are 2 categories then, number 3 and 4, and the ruling is the same for each. So in both of these cases, the blood money is a ghurra, as the hadith mentions, which is a male or a female servant. If not, then it would be 5 camels, or the money equivalent thereof. So all of these 4 categories are pertaining to after 4 months, which is when the soul has been blown into him. Now the second category, when the soul has not been blown into him, so this is before the 4-month threshold. Number 1, if we can see the features of a human being in him. So he's at this mudgha stage. So if we can see the features of human beings in him, then his blood money would be a ghurra, which is a male or female servant. And subcategory number 2, we cannot see the features of a human being in him. In this case, there would be no blood money whatsoever. So these are your categories. Just to recap, there are 2 main categories. Number 1, after the soul has been blown in, and number 2, before the soul has been blown in. So category number 1 has 4 subcategories, and category number 2 has 2 subcategories, each with their own respective rulings.
Now, as you can tell, this opinion has all these categories and subcategories. It's fairly complicated. There is another opinion which says that in all cases the blood money is a ghurra, because the hadith is general, so it does not matter at which stage of pregnancy you're in. And this appears to be the easier opinion to follow, because the narration is, after all, general, and the Prophet did not inquire about the stage of pregnancy. And this is as long as it dies in the belly. As for if it dies after being born, meaning after 6 months, then it is to be treated like any other person with regards to blood money. And the normal blood money applies, which we have yet to speak about. And Allah knows best.
So that deals with the blood money, but there is a second element as well when it comes to accidental murder, either the khata or the shibhul amd, and this is the kaffara. The kaffara for accidental murder or quasi-intentional murder is either to free a believing servant. If you cannot do that, it is to fast 2 consecutive lunar months. Now, for a child which is in the belly of the mother, if this child dies, the kaffara must be offered, except in the case where the soul has not been blown into him, because there, obviously, you have not killed a human soul, or put in other words, you have not taken a human life, because there was no life to begin with. Or, the second case is if this child, even after the soul has been blown in, but if he dies simultaneously with the mother, then there is no kaffara for this child, rather, there is only the kaffara for the mother, which you would have to offer, of course. Like we said, this would be freeing a believing servant or fasting 2 consecutive lunar months.
However, if somebody were to argue that there are 2 kaffarat, one for the mother and one for the fetus, after 4 months or 120 days when the soul has been blown in, then if they were to argue for 2 kaffarat, then this is an understandable opinion, and Allah knows best.
Somebody might ask here, in the first category, after the soul has been blown in, we said that one of the subcategories is that he is delivered from the belly and he lives, but then he dies. But the point is, if he lives then he dies, then why does the perpetrator need to pay the blood money? Because if the child is living, then what's the need to pay the blood money? Well, we say that he could be born alive and then die because of the injury which he sustained as a result of the attack from the perpetrator. However, if he is born alive and then he lives long enough and then dies afterwards, then it could be the case that the cause of his death was not the attack of the perpetrator. So if that is the case, and we can be certain of that, then the perpetrator will not need to pay the blood money for the death of this child, because the death of this child was nothing to do with the attack of the perpetrator. So just note that difference. We said that the aqila would pay the blood money. How should this be distributed out? It should be distributed in accordance with their means, so the richer ones will pay more, the poorer ones will pay less. We also take from this hadith that the blood money which is given to the victim is money which can be inherited after the death of the victim. Because we find here in the hadith that the blood money was given because of this death of the child. Now the inheritors of the child would inherit this blood money. And so from this we can say that the blood money which is given to the victim, if the victim had left a wasiyah, and then let's say the wasiyah is a third because that's the most you can give, then from this blood money you have to take away and contribute it to the wasiyah. So if the wasiyah is, let's say, a third, then a third of this diyah would be taken and given to the cause of the wasiyah. So basically, just putting it simply, the wasiyah is effective on the blood money given to the victim. We find in this narration that Hamal ibn Nabigha uses some eloquent and rhyming speech to oppose the decision of the Prophet. Using rhyming speech is not haram in and of itself. The Prophet ﷺ himself did it. For example, in the hadith, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa' wa qawlin la yusma' wa qalbin la yakhsha' wa nafsin la tashba' wa a'udhu bika min ha'ula'i al-arba'. So you can see that all of these sentences are ending with an ayn, and it all rhymes. And this is a dua found in the Sahih, which is legislated for Muslims to say often, because it is a reported dua from the Prophet. But the point is, it rhymes. However, if you make your speech to rhyme in order to argue for that which is batil, which is what Hamal was doing here, or you come up with rhyming words, and because of this, it corrupts the meaning of the sentence, or you begin to use words in places which they are not meant to be used, then this should not be done. Certainly if you use rhyming speech to argue for the batil, then as the Prophet said, this makes you into one of the brothers of the soothsayers, because this is what the soothsayers would do. They would obviously use their batil speech, but they would adorn it by making it rhyme. And so brother in this case does not mean that you share the same parents, rather brother here means that what you are doing is similar to them. Like how Allah says, إِنَّ الْمُبَذِّرِينَ كَانُوا إِخْوَانَ الشَّيَاطِينَ. These spendthrifts are the brothers of the shayateen. It does not mean that you share the same parents as the shayateen, but rather what you are doing is from the sunnah of the shayateen. When Maryam alayhi salam brought the child, Isa alayhi salam, the people said to her, يَا أُخْتَ هَارُونَ ما كان أبوك امرأ سوء وما كانت أمك بغية. O sister of Harun, your father was not an evil man, like a fornicator, and neither was your mother a prostitute. So how is it then that you have brought this child? Obviously this must be through fornication, must it not? But the point is that they called her the sister of Harun. Now the point is, did Maryam have a brother called Harun? Well, not necessarily. Some of the Mufassirin have said that Harun was a righteous man in their tribe, and Maryam was his sister not through blood but in terms of her actions, so she was also extremely righteous. So how can a righteous woman like her bring a child out of wedlock? Some of the Mufassirin have said that Harun was in fact an evil man in their tribe, known for fornication and so on, so they called her the sister of Harun, meaning to say what she's doing is similar to the actions of this licentious man Harun, which is why she has brought this child out of wedlock. And other Mufassirin have said that Maryam was from the descendants of Harun alayhi salam, the great prophet and brother of Musa, and so they are calling her sister of Harun because of that relation. So the point is that when you call somebody a brother or sister, it doesn't necessarily mean that they share the same parents, rather it depends on the context. You could be a brother of someone or a sister of someone if you share their same actions or similar actions. So sister and brother does not always mean someone who shares the same parents or parent as you. Hadith 1017 وعن أنس رضي الله عنه. From Anas radiallahu an, he says that Ar-Rubai' bint al-Nadr, who is the paternal aunt of Anas ibn Malik, she broke the tooth of a young girl, and this is the front tooth, and so the family members of the victim, they demanded retaliation, which is al-qisas, and they did not pardon Ar-Rubai' bint al-Nadr. The family of Ar-Rubai' bint al-Nadr, they wanted to pay compensation instead of having the tooth of Ar-Rubai' broken. However, the family of the victims, they refused. They were adamant that they wanted retaliation. And so they came to the Prophet to sort out the affair. And the family of the victims, they wanted al-qisas. And so the Prophet ﷺ had no choice but to order the qisas. And upon this, a man called Anas ibn Nadr, the brother of Ar-Rubai', he said to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, أتكسر ثنية الربيع؟ لا والذي بعثك بالحق لا تكسر ثنيتها. He said, O Messenger of Allah, are the front tooth of Ar-Rubai' going to be broken? No, by the one who has sent you with the truth, the front teeth of Ar-Rubai' will not be broken. And so the Prophet replied, Ya Anas, Kitabullahil qisas. O Anas, the order of Allah is qisas, meaning retaliation. And so it came to pass that the family of the victims changed their mind and they did not want retaliation anymore and they forgave Ar-Rubai'. So we have a sudden twist of events now. And upon this, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ مِنْ عِبَادِ اللَّهِ مَنْ لَوْ أَقْسَمَ عَلَى اللَّهِ لَأَبَرَّهُ مُتَّفَقٌ عَلَيْهِ وَلَفْظُ لِلْبُخَارِي. Verily, from the slaves of Allah is the one who, if he takes an oath against Allah, meaning if he adjures Allah, then Allah will fulfill the oath of his. Muttafaqun alayh, and the wording is of Al-Bukhari. This narration is about Al-Qisas, which is the retaliation, and this is a well-known law in the Quran, but even before that in the Torah. And in fact we find that this law is passed on to the Sharia from the law or the Sharia of Musa alayhi salam, because this is a law originally found in the Torah. Allah Jalla wa Ala says in the Quran, وَكَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ فِيهَا أَنَّ النَّفْسَ بِالنَّفْسِ وَالْعَيْنَ بِالْعَيْنِ وَالْأَنْفَ بِالْأَنْفِ وَالْأُذُنَ بِالْأُذُنِ وَالسِّنَّ بِالسِّنِّ وَالْجُرُوحَ قِصَاصٌ فَمَنْ تَصَدَّقَ بِهِ فَهُوَ كَفَّارَةٌ لَهُ وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. And we ordain for them in it, meaning in the Torah, that a life is to be taken for a life, eye for an eye, nose for a nose, ear for an ear, tooth for a tooth, and all injuries are to be retaliated against likewise. But whoever forgives the perpetrator, then this injury which he has suffered will be a kaffara for him, meaning it will expiate his sins. And whoever does not judge by what Allah has sent down, then they are the oppressors, meaning to say they are the wrongdoers. So we find here that this law comes from the Torah originally, and the Sharia has approved of it. So in this narration then, we have the situation of a tooth for a tooth, just as the Quran says, and just as it was in the Torah. And this tells us as well that the laws of the Torah are the same laws as our Sharia, unless we have evidence otherwise. So any law which is spoken of in the Torah is also a law for us, unless the Sharia tells us otherwise. So if the victim sustains an injury unjustly by the perpetrator, then he has a choice. Either he can retaliate by giving the perpetrator the same injury back, but this is subject to conditions as well, which we need to speak of later. He also has a choice of taking blood money instead of the retaliation, and this should be spoken about more in the chapter of the blood money. And the third option which he has is to simply forgive, so neither take the blood money nor retaliation. And this is the best option to take as far as the hereafter is concerned, because there is a great reward for you in compensation for your forgiveness in the hereafter, because forgiveness is difficult in a situation like this. You are seeking revenge, or if not physical revenge, certainly you're seeking some sort of financial compensation. This is the usual choice. So if you went on to make the most difficult choice, then it is only fair that Allah Jalla wa Ala should recompense you from His own self in the hereafter. And this is often the hardest choices which are the most reward worthy, and this makes perfect sense.
We also have authentically reported in the Sunan, Anas radiallahu anhu reports that every time a case was brought to the Prophet pertaining to qisas, the Prophet would advise the victim to forgive.
And so we can take here that the perpetrator or the family of the perpetrator can approach the family of the victim and ask them to forgive the perpetrator. Because in this situation here, the Prophet acknowledged that the family of the perpetrator are asking the victim to forgive them. We find here that Anas ibn Nadr, the brother of Al-Rubai', takes an oath by Allah that the tooth of Al-Rubai' will not be broken. On the face of it, it appears that he's going against the decision of the Prophet ﷺ. But actually, he is not, because it is unbecoming of any Muslim, not least a Sahabi, to directly and shamelessly oppose the decision of the Prophet ﷺ. Though on the face of it, it does appear that he's objecting to this decision, he is not. Actually, this is called taking an oath against Allah, and it is a type of adjuring Allah or beseeching Allah. So you're really requesting Allah to do something for you. So here, Anas ibn Nadr is being extremely hopeful of Allah that Allah will somehow devise this situation so that the family of the victim will forgive Al-Rubai', and that somehow the teeth of Al-Rubai' will not be broken. That somehow Allah will find a way such that the teeth of Al-Rubai' will not be broken. He is being extremely hopeful that Allah will find a way out for them. So this is why he takes an oath here against Allah. He takes an oath that the teeth will not be broken. It is just another way of beseeching Allah Jalla wa'ala. So what's driving him to make this oath is being hopeful. What he is not doing is taking an oath by Allah that something against the Sharia will happen, or that Allah will do something which goes against the Sharia or against that which is right and proper. Because what we find here is that what is right and proper is that the retaliation should take place. Why is this right and proper? Well, because this is the law of Allah Jalla wa'ala. And all the law of Allah Jalla wa'ala is, by definition, right and proper. So here he's not saying that Allah will do something which is not right and proper. Rather, he is hopeful that Allah Jalla wa'ala will find a way out for Al-Rubai'. An example of when you take an oath by Allah against that which is right and proper is the example in the authentic hadith which we have, and you'll find this in our presentation of the Kitab al-Tawheed, when a man finds another man committing a sin and he tells him to stop, and then the man doesn't stop, he keeps committing the sin, and the sinner says, "Leave me alone, my affair is with Allah Jalla wa'ala, you don't need to interfere." And so this man who is giving the advice, he says, "Wallahi la yaghfirullahu li fulan." Wallahi, by Allah, Allah will not forgive such and such a person, meaning this person who is committing the sin, that Allah will not forgive him. So he is taking an oath here that Allah will deprive this person of the mercy of Allah. And so upon this, Allah Jalla wa'ala replies, "Man dha alladhi yata'alla alayya alla aghfira li fulan." Who is taking an oath against me that I will not forgive such and such a person? قَدْ غَفَرْتُ لَهُ وَأَحْبَطْتُ عَمَلَكَ. Rather, I have forgiven him and I have rendered your deeds to be vain. So look at this turn of events. The one who was advising the other not to commit sin, his deeds have become null and void, and the one who was consistently committing the sin, his sins are forgiven. And why is this? Because this man, the one who was giving the advice, he took an oath by Allah that Allah Jalla wa'ala will not do something which is right and proper. Allah Jalla wa'ala forgiving people for their sins is right and proper. So here he's trying to deprive the mercy of Allah from a servant of Allah Jalla wa'ala. So you must never ever say to anyone, no matter how sinful you deem him to be, you must never tell him, "Wallahi la yaghfirullahu lak." By Allah, Allah will never forgive you. We find from this hadith that from the slaves of Allah are those who, when they beseech Allah, then Allah will accede to their request. And we can say quite safely, therefore, that Anas ibn Nadr is one of these men who holds this most prestigious position. Imagine you being somebody who, when you beseech Allah to fulfill a need of yours, then Allah will immediately respond in the affirmative. Imagine what a blessing that is. And these types of people do not have to be people of high society or people who are immediately noticeable, Rather, they could be people who are the lowest of the low in society. As the Prophet ﷺ said, رُبَّ أَشْعَثَ أَغْبَرَ مَدْفُوعٌ بِالْأَبْوَابِ لَوْ أَقْسَمَ عَلَى اللَّهِ لَأَبَرَّهُ. How many people who are dusty, meaning they have dusty clothes, and disheveled hair, meaning they look like lowlifes, and they are thrown against the door, meaning to say when they enter somebody's house, the people will not even allow them to enter because they are of such low status in society, so they are simply pushed against the door. How many of these types of people, when they adjure Allah, then Allah accedes to their request. And also with this hadith, we can conclude that Allah is as His servant thinks He is. Because Anas ibn Nadhr here thought positively and thought well of Allah Jalla wa Ala, lo and behold, Allah Jalla wa Ala proved Himself to be just as Anas ibn Nadhr thought. So the practical lesson which we can take from this is that you must always have positive thoughts of Allah Jalla wa Ala, never any negative thoughts. In fact, thinking negatively of Allah is from the trademarks of the Jahiliyyah, and Allah Jalla wa Ala calls this dhannu as-saw, the evil or negative thoughts of Allah Jalla wa Ala. What about if somebody takes an oath by Allah that you will do something for him? So for example, he says, by Allah, you will help me with my homework. He's taken an oath by Allah that you will do something for him. Well, the Prophet ordered here that when somebody takes an oath by Allah that you will do something for him, then you should fulfill this oath of his. And that he has a right against you that you should fulfill his oath. And this is the Ibrarul Qasam, which the Prophet spoke about when he spoke about the right that a Muslim has over another Muslim brother of his. So we say this is the case as long as it does not lead to a harm against you. So for example, if he says, by Allah, you will give me khamr to drink. Now this will seriously lead to a harm against you, so therefore you do not do it. Or for example, if he says, by Allah, you will tell me what you did with your wife the other night. Private conjugal affairs like these are not to be spoken out in public to anyone else. So again, this will be a harm against you, both in your worldly life, but especially in your hereafter as well, because it's a sinful activity. Then you do not fulfill this type of an oath. As far as the tooth situation is concerned, which is what this narration is talking about, well, if somebody injures you unjustly and completely knocks your tooth out, then you do have the right to have his tooth removed as well. The problem comes if he breaks part of your tooth, so it is still intact, but say it's halfway there. Then some scholars said, well, it's not possible to break somebody's tooth halfway or a fraction of a tooth. Perhaps they said this at a time when it was not possible to do so, but we find that if it is possible to do so, then it must be done. So if a part of the tooth is broken, then you have the right to break off that particular part as well, or that fraction of the tooth which he broke from you, if it is physically possible to do so. If it is not physically possible to do so, then we have to resort to blood money. So on this topic then, it would be a good idea to talk about al-qisas. Al-qisas in the Arabic language, firstly, means to follow some tracks or some footprints, let's say, which are left behind. So it has this idea of following something. As in the Quran, فَارْتَدَّ عَلَى آثَارِهِمَا قَصَصًا. They followed their footprints back, meaning to say Musa alayhi salam and his servant. And this happened when they were looking for Khidr. And in the Sharia, it simply means retaliation that you do to your perpetrator as he did to you. So life for a life or injury for an injury. The question is, which is better? To take retaliation, or to take the blood money, or to simply forgive? Well, we say the best choice is the one which is most beneficial. Sometimes it could be forgiveness which is most beneficial because this will lead to a rectification in the affairs. If forgiveness will not lead to a rectification in the affair, and it will not deter other people from committing this crime, it could be that the crime is widespread, then in this case public retaliation serves the benefit of the people, because it would serve as a deterrent to other people who would follow the perpetrator in his crime. The ulama have said that in the Sharia of Musa alayhi salam, qisas was wajib. So if somebody injured you, then you had to injure him back, and you had no choice to forgive him or take blood money. But here, in this Sharia, it gives us more variety, and so therefore it lessens the load. So we find that the Sharia of Musa alayhi salam was very strict. As for the Christians, then in their law system they have the turn the other cheek rubbish which they speak about. Well, firstly, this is impractical. Nobody really follows it, so it's a complete waste of time really. And then secondly, it is actually on the extreme end, because turning the other cheek doesn't always produce good effects. It can do, certainly, but not in every single situation. So every case needs to be assessed on its merits. So yes, sometimes forgiveness is better, sometimes blood money is better, but sometimes retaliation is better. It all depends on the particular case and the welfare of the general population. And this is again an example of where the Islamic Sharia is in the middle. It does not veer towards either end of the extreme. About al-qisas, Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. And in qisas there is life for you, O people of sound intellect. Even though you're taking a life for a life, so actually now we have two lives lost instead of one life which is lost. But if we look at the picture at large, then we find that it acts as a deterrent, and it will reduce the overall number of killing and murders in the society. So therefore it gives the society life. Well, the issue of forgiveness is simple enough to understand, and the chapter of diya or blood money is coming up. So let us now focus our attention on al-qisas, which is the physical retaliation. And the first thing we need to know here are the conditions to be fulfilled before the qisas can be implemented. Because it is not necessary that if somebody kills another innocent person, that the perpetrator will have to be killed. No, rather we have to look to see, are the conditions met for the perpetrator to be worthy for the death penalty. And so what are the conditions? There are four. Number one, the perpetrator must have an usma, which means he must be ma'soom, which means that his life and his wealth is protected under the Islamic State. So for example, if a Muslim kills a harbi kafir, then do we say that the family of the harbi kafir are entitled to take blood revenge against the Muslim? Well, the answer is no, because the harbi is not ma'soom. His life and wealth are fair game. And it needs to be known that the people who are ma'soom are of four types. Firstly, the Muslim, and three types of kuffar, and they are the dhimmi, the mu'ahad, and the musta'man. These four types of people are ma'soom, meaning to say that their wealth and their life is protected in the Sharia. Similarly, if a dhimmi was to kill a harbi, so one kafir kills another kafir, then we will not allow the family of the harbi to take retaliation against the dhimmi. Or what if, for example, a Muslim kills a murtad? Well, the murtad, he is not ma'soom. So in a case like this, the Muslim will not be given a death penalty. However, the Imam can still give this Muslim a ta'zir punishment, which is any punishment he deems to be fit, because the point is, he should not have taken the matter into his own hands. But he is not allowed to be retaliated against in a life-for-life situation, because the person he killed was not ma'soom. Condition number two, the perpetrator must be a mukallaf, which basically means he must be baligh and aqil. Therefore, no retaliation can be made against a person who is insane, or one who is sleeping, or one who is young, so he's not reached the age of adolescence. Because these people don't have a valid intention. And so what we're talking about here is that the qisas can only be done through an injury or a murder which is intentional. But these people don't have an intention in the very first place, so therefore there can be no qisas against them. There can be blood money, but no qisas. Similarly, if we have a man who reaches the age of senility, so he's so old that he has deficient intellect, so he resembles a mad person, so his intellect reaches that sort of level, then if he was to commit murder, he would not be retaliated against, because he resembles a madman more than a sane man. Similarly, if a person is drunk and he commits murder, he would not be killed in retaliation. And the reason is because he does not have his intellect, so he resembles a madman and not a sane man. So the point is that your intellect needs to be intact, and you must have reached the age of adolescence. This is the case as long as we know that he did not drink this khamr on purpose to become drunk, so as to give himself an excuse to commit murder. If we know that this is in fact his evil and nefarious intention, then he would be put to the sword and he would be worthy of the death penalty. The fourth condition is al-mukafa'ah, that the killer and the killed must be of equal status. So this needs to be explained. It simply means that a Muslim is not killed for a kafir because a Muslim is of a higher status than a kafir, and that a free person is not killed for a servant. And as for the evidence that a Muslim is not killed for a kafir, we know with the narration of Ali bin Abi Talib, where in the scripture he said, it is contained in it, al-fikak, al-aql wa fikak al-asir wa an la yuqtala muslimun bikafir. The blood money and that the prisoner needs to be released, and also that a Muslim is not killed for a kafir. And also we took the other hadith as well, that the blood of the Muslims are equal and any one of them can give protection to a kafir, and that they are one hand against the kuffar, and that a Muslim is not killed for a kafir. As for a servant being killed for a free person, then there is no difference of opinion on this issue. The difference of opinion is, can a free man be killed for a servant man? The evidence of the majority of the scholars who say that a free man is not to be killed for a servant, they use the ayah of the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِصَاصُ فِي الْقَتْلَى. O you who believe, retaliation is prescribed for you in the case of murder. الْحُرُّ بِالْحُرِّ وَالْعَبْدُ بِالْعَبْدِ وَالْأُنْثَى بِالْأُنْثَى. The free for the free, the servant for the servant, and the female for the female. So a servant can be killed for a servant. They say this means that the free is not killed for a servant. A free is only killed for a free, just as the ayah says. Al-Imam Abu Hanifa and Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahumullah, they say that a free can be killed for a servant. And they use as their evidence the hadith which we mentioned, the Prophet saying, Man qatala abdahu qatalnahu, wa man jada'a abdahu jada'na. Whoever kills his servant, we will kill him, and whoever maims his servant, we will maim him. But then the discussion would be on the authenticity of this hadith. So those scholars who take this hadith to be authentic, they will go by it. And those scholars who say this hadith is da'if, they will not go by it. And the majority of the scholars say that a free person is not killed for a servant. But then this ayah of the Quran also talks about a female being killed for a female. Does this then mean that a male is not killed for a female? The scholars say no, the male can be killed for a female. This is due to the generality of the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah, وَكَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ فِيهَا أَنَّ النَّفْسَ بِالنَّفْسِ. And we ordained for them therein that a soul is to be taken for a soul. So this makes no difference whether you're male or female. And also you'll remember the hadith which came earlier on, that the blood of a Muslim is not halal to be taken except for 3 causes. And so this is general, it includes males and females. And also the statement of the Prophet, Al-mu'minuna tatakafa'u dima'uhum, that the blood of the believers is equal. And we further have another hadith which we quoted, that the Prophet crushed the head of a Yahudi because he crushed the head of a young girl because of some jewelry which he snatched from her. And it cannot be said that this Yahudi was only killed because he broke the peace treaty between himself and the Muslim. Because if that was the case, he would have been killed with the sword, which would be the standard punishment. But here we find he was killed in the same way he killed the girl, which means that this is not a state punishment for breaking the contract, but rather this is qisas. And so a male can be killed for a female. Some scholars have said that the male is not killed for the female because the male is superior. And we know this because, for example, the blood money of the male is higher than that of the female. We say, yes, the blood money may well be superior, but the issue of the blood money is something which the Sharia stipulates itself. It's not something which we give a value to. So we say that the male is superior, so we give him a superior value. And then the blood money is different to retaliation. The blood money is one ruling and retaliation is another ruling. So we cannot conflate these 2 different issues. We have to look at each issue on its merit. They may also say, but Allah says, وَالْأُنْثَى بِالْأُنْثَى, and the female for the female. This means the male is not killed for the female. We say, yes, this is what is understood from the ayah, but as long as we have other evidences which shed more light on this issue, and they tell us that the male is killed for the female, just as this hadith of the Yahudi, then this is much more of a direct evidence. As for the ayah, then our inference from that ayah is indirect, and the direct takes precedence over the indirect. They may also say, but the Yahudi is a non-Muslim and the girl may have been a Muslim, but if the Yahudi had been a Muslim, then he would not be killed for her. And so basically, the only reason why he was killed is because he was a Yahudi. If he had been a Muslim, then he would not have been killed. But we say that the qisas was taken. It was not a state punishment. So, we know he's a Yahudi. If he's a Yahudi, then he kills a Muslim. This means he breaks the contract, and so the qisas is not applied to somebody like this. Rather, this person is to be killed by the Imam via the sword, not via qisas. But the fact that the qisas was taken tells us that a man is killed for a woman via a qisas if he kills her. And then we have the fourth condition, which is that the killer must not be the father or the forefather of the killed or the victim. We took the evidence for this and we discussed this issue previously. We said this applies to the father, the grandfather, and going up that way, and also to the mother as well, going up in that line. And they give their reason. They say that the father is the cause for the existence of the child, so it is not fitting that the child should be the cause for the execution of the father. But if we look at this reasoning, we find, in fact, the child is not the cause for the execution of the father. The father is the cause for the execution of himself if he was to murder his child. And as for the hadith, لا يقاد الوالد بالولد, then we know it to be da'if. So if that's the case, then we have to return to the generality of the evidence, and the generality of the evidence says a life for a life. So based upon this, if the father deliberately kills his child, then he can be killed. And most scholars say that he is not killed. We might add a fifth condition and simply say that this killing must be intentional, or the injury must be intentional. If we don't want to add this condition in, then at the beginning we would have to say that the condition for the qisas for intentional murder or injury are 4 conditions. So either way, it's the same thing. We are letting people know clearly that it has to be an intentional transgression. There are some scholars who have added another condition. They said that if the killer is the sultan or the supreme ruler, then he must not be retaliated against. And the reason they give is because if you kill the ruler, then this leads to much chaos and anarchy in the land. And this is an understandable opinion, but the counter opinion would be that he is still to be killed because the evidence is general, and the Sharia does not make an exception for the sultan. And also, if we allowed the sultan not to be killed, then this could encourage the oppressive rulers to kill their people. Both opinions are understandable, and so this is a debatable issue. And it appears that we would have to treat each particular real-life incident on its merit. It could be that if you were to retaliate and kill the ruler, then it is likely that it will lead to chaos and anarchy in the land. In the case like this, it would be wise for us not to kill the ruler, because we have to avoid the greater of the 2 harms. If it does not lead to anarchy, or we do not think it is likely to lead to anarchy, the country is peaceful and the ruler can be replaced quite easily, then in this case we have a strong reason to be consistent with our ruling and to kill the ruler if he unjustly kills somebody. So these were the conditions for the qisas to be taken. Let's just recap them. Number 1, the one who is killed needs to be ma'soom. Number 2, the killer needs to be mukallaf. Number 3, there needs to be mukafa'ah, meaning equality in the status. And fourthly, the killer must not be the father or the parent of the killed, though of course this is debatable. And then some scholars have another condition, which is that the killer must not be the sultan. And of course we can also add the obvious condition that it must be intentional murder, as opposed to unintentional or quasi-intentional murder. Now, if these conditions are met and the qisas can be taken, then there are yet further conditions which need to be met from the side of the family of the victims, because not every wali of the victim is entitled to claim the qisas. There must be conditions which are met, and these are as follows. Number 1, the wali of the victim must be mukallaf, which is that he is baligh and aqil. So a madman cannot decide that he wants qisas, and neither a person below the age of adolescence can decide that he wants qisas. And when we say wali of the victim, we mean the inheritor, whether the inheritor is inheriting from the victim through the fard, or the ta'asib, or the rahim, or the wala. So if we find that one of the inheritors is either too young, so he's below adolescence, or he is insane, then we would have to wait until he reaches the age of adolescence, or that his madness is removed, and only then the qisas can be taken. There are some scholars who make an exception. They say that if the killing was of a ghila type, and a ghila is when you take somebody out unaware, so it's not like you meet them head on, and so you have some sort of fight and you end up killing him, intentionally of course, but rather ghila is when you take him unaware. Maybe it could be that you trick him into trusting you, and then you betray his trust and kill him, or just any manner in which you take him out unaware. So in a case like this, some scholars, including Imam Malik, they say it is obligatory upon the Sultan to kill him in return, whether the awliya agree to this or not. The second condition is that all of the awliya, meaning the inheritors, must agree to the qisas. So if one or some don't agree, then we cannot have the qisas. And the evidence for this, Allah Jalla wa Ala saying, فَمَنْ عُفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ فَاتِّبَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَأَدَاءٌ إِلَيْهِ بِإِحْسَانٍ. And whoever is forgiven in any way from his brother, then this forgiveness must be followed properly, so that the killer is not to be harmed. وَأَدَاءٌ إِلَيْهِ بِإِحْسَانٍ, and that the killer must pay the blood money with goodness. They must properly pay the blood money without any arguments. But the point is that the word shay'un is used, which means anything. So, if any of the awliya of the victim forgive the killer, then we cannot have qisas. At best, we can have blood money. And naturally, we cannot say that the ones who do want qisas, we will kill the killer for them. Because how can we kill the killer for some of the awliya but not for others? You cannot have fraction of a killing. That is simply impossible. So we have to resort to blood money. And if it's the case that you cannot get in contact with one of the awliya, then you have to wait until you are in contact with him. Because the qisas cannot take place until all of the awliya agree. Because they each have equal right. Then we have the third condition, and this is that in taking this qisas, there must be no transgression. What do we mean by this? Well, an example could be that if the woman has killed intentionally, and this woman happens to be pregnant, then we cannot take qisas, because in killing the woman, we would be killing the child as well. And the child does not deserve to die, of course. And it makes no difference at which stage this pregnancy is in. So even if the soul has not been blown into the child, still you have to wait until the child is born. And also it makes no difference when she conceived. So it does not make a difference whether she was pregnant when she killed intentionally, or if she killed intentionally, then afterwards she became pregnant. It does not make a difference. We have to wait, in all cases, for her to deliver the child first. But when the child is born, what about the breastfeeding period? Well, if we can find somebody to breastfeed the child, then the mother is to be put to death. If that's not possible, then we will give the mother time to breastfeed the child. Then after that, the qisas can be taken. And a similar ruling applies if the qisas is pertaining to one of the limbs. So it's not about life, but for example, this woman cut off somebody else's hand unjustly, so her hand is to be cut off in retaliation. If she is pregnant, then her hand is not to be cut off until she gives birth to the child. Because in injuring her, we could be injuring the child as well. Or it could be that the fright the mother experiences affects the child, so we are not allowed to do that. So any retaliation, whether it be life or limb, needs to be taken after she delivers the child. And also, it's the same thing with the had punishment as well, and for this we have a specific evidence, the woman from Al-Ghamid, who was pregnant because of zina, and so the Prophet gave her respite until she delivers the load, and then she was stoned to death. And the Prophet said that she made such a tawbah that if it was to be distributed among 70 people of Al-Madinah, it would be enough to save each of them. So notice here that the first four conditions answer the question, is the qisas applicable? And the last three conditions answer the question,
Can the qiyas be implemented? Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. What is the general rule about when a person attacks another and sustains an injury, and the injury increases to something worse? Speak from the point of view of the assailant and from the point of view of the victim. Question number 2. In the hadith of Anas ibn Nadr and Rubai' bint Nadr, we have an evidence that the Sharia of the previous prophets is our Sharia as a default rule. Explain how that narration proves this point. Question number 3. Give 5 conditions for the qisas to be applicable and 3 conditions for the qisas to be implemented.